The fields, once alive with the chatter of peasants and the laughter of children, now lay quiet under the heavy summer sun, where there had been the sound of plows cutting through the soil and oxen grunting at their burden. There was now only silence, broken only by the wind whistling across the empty meadows. Cottages stood abandoned, doors swinging open as though the inhabitants had fled in haste. In many of them, no one remained alive to shut the door. It was the year 1383, 35 years since the Black Death had swept across England, yet in villages like ours its shadow lingered. Half our people were gone, carried to shallow graves or piled into mass pits when the bodies had grown too many to bury with ceremony. Those who survived were marked forever, by loss, by fear, and by the strange opportunities that death had left in its wake. I was a boy of 10 when the plague came. Now I was a man of 45, though my bones felt older. I remembered the stench most of all. The stench of decay that rolled through the lanes like a tide. They said it was punishment from God, a cleansing of the wicked, but as I watched my mother cough blood into her apron, and my younger sister's body twist in fever, I could not believe that sin alone had caused it. Whatever its cause, the Black Death had left us in a new world, a world where the old order no longer held firm. The village transformed. Before the plague, we peasants lived under the Lord's thumb. Our days were measured in service, plowing his land, harvesting his grain, mending his fences. Serfs we were, bound to the soil, owning nothing but the rags on our backs, forbidden to leave without permission. Wages were low, food meager, freedom unthinkable. But death had changed all that. Whole families vanished, leaving behind cottages, fields, and tools. With so many gone, labor became precious. A man's strong arms were suddenly worth more than any parchment law. We who once bent our backs for scraps now found that lords needed us, and in that need lay power. I myself came into land I had never dreamed of. My uncle, his wife, and their children all died within days of each other. With no heir left, his small strip of field passed to me. I was no longer merely a servant. I tilled my own earth, planted my own barley, and sold my yield in the market. What had been impossible in my father's day was now mine, as if the plague had rewritten the rules of life. Yet the lords did not give up their hold easily. They saw their rents fall and their fields lie idle for want of hands, and they grew desperate. They tried to force us back into the old chains. In the year 1351, King Edward and his council passed a law, the Statute of Laborers. It declared that no man should demand more wages than he had before the pestilence, and no master should offer higher pay. If a worker refused, he could be jailed. The law also forbade us to leave our villages in search of better terms. But parchment cannot plow a field, and a seal cannot bind a man's hunger. Lords might shout about the law, but their crops still needed cutting, their sheep still needed tending, and so though they scolded us, many paid more in secret. I earned twice the wage my father had, though I risked punishment if caught. Still, the tension grew. We peasants felt our worth. We knew that without us the land would waste away, and once a man has tasted freedom, even a little, he does not easily return to chains. Our own lord, Sir Edmund of Greystone Manor, once held 50 servants in his hall. He rode with a retinue of knights, and no peasant dared meet his gaze. But by the time I reached my middle years, his hall echoed with emptiness. His eldest son had perished in the pestilence, his household staff reduced to a handful, his barns rotted for lack of repair. I recall one harvest when he strode into the village square, crimson with rage. "You will reap my barley at the old wage," he bellowed, "or by God's name I shall have you whipped." We stood silent at first, the memory of past punishments heavy on us. But then old Matthew, a stooped man who had lost 3 sons to the pestilence, raised his head. "Whip us, my lord," he said, voice trembling but firm, "but you'll have no harvest then, and hunger will bite your table as it bites ours." A murmur of agreement rose among us. For the first time, Lord Edmund faltered. He needed us more than we feared him, and in that moment I knew the world had shifted. Seeds of rebellion. Across England similar scenes played out. From Norfolk to Kent, peasants pressed for better terms and lords fought to keep their grip. Frustration boiled like water on the fire. Taxes rose heavy and unfair to fund wars in France that brought us no gain. Officials grew fat on bribes, priests preached obedience while living in luxury, and always the memory of plague whispered that life was short and fragile. By the early 1380s, discontent was everywhere. Rumors spread of meetings in taverns, of secret promises among laborers and villains. They spoke of abolishing serfdom entirely, of breaking free from lords, of standing equal under God. To many, these were dangerous, even blasphemous thoughts, but once heard they could not be forgotten. I remember one winter evening when a traveling preacher, a man called John Ball, came through our village. His words burned hotter than the hearth fire. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? We stared breathless. He was saying what none of us dared say aloud, that all men were born equal, that lords and peasants were but roles created by greed. If this were true, then why should we bow, why should we starve while others feasted? His words lit sparks in our hearts, sparks that come summer would blaze into revolt. A fragile hope. For now though, I worked my field and raised my children in the fragile peace of our altered world. My eldest son William spoke often of leaving to find work in London, where wages were said to be higher still. My daughter Alice tended sheep on the downs, her laughter a reminder that life endured even after so much loss. Yet always at the edge of thought lingered unease. We had gained land, wages, and dignity, but all could be taken with the stroke of a pen or the swing of a sword. Lords grumbled, sheriffs threatened, and the king's men collected taxes more cruelly each year. I could not yet know that within months the people's anger would boil over, that we would march not just to our Lord's manor but to the gates of London itself, that I, a humble peasant of Greystone, would find myself standing before a boy king demanding freedom. But the silence after death had already taught me this. When half the world has perished, the survivors learn to grasp at life with new hands, and we were ready to grasp. The summer of 1381 burned hotter than any in memory. The air shimmered over the fields, wheat ripening fast beneath a blazing sun. But it was not only the weather that set England alight, it was anger. For years the crown had burdened us with poll taxes, levied not on land or wealth but on every head, rich or poor alike. It mattered nothing if you were a tenant farmer scratching a living from thin soil. The collectors came and demanded the same as they did from merchants fat with silver. 3 times in recent years had the tax been raised, and by the third patience was gone. I remember the day the collectors came to Greystone. They arrived on horseback, clad in fine cloaks, parchment rolls dangling from their belts. One strode into the village square and read aloud the king's decree. Every man and woman above the age of 15 shall pay this tax. None are exempt. Refusal is treason. A murmur of protest rippled through the crowd. Treason? We who tilled the land, who fed the realm. My neighbor Thomas spat on the ground, muttering that the Lord should pay double if justice had meaning. The collector's eyes narrowed. He seized Thomas by the collar, struck him across the face, and threatened to drag him before the sheriff. That blow, I think, was the spark that set our village aflame. The uprising begins. That night, men and women gathered in the barn of old Matthew. Torchlight flickered against beams blackened with smoke, and voices hissed low but urgent. "We cannot pay," Thomas said, a bruise swelling his cheek, "nor will we. Let them whip us, jail us, hang us, better that than starving our children." Murmurs of assent rose. I looked around and saw in the eyes of my fellows not fear but fury. Then Matthew spoke, his voice carrying a strength that belied his frailty. "The time has come to stand as one, not only against the tax but against the bondage that holds us still. Have we not tasted freedom since the pestilence? Have we not proved our worth? Why should we bow to lords who cannot work their own fields or priests who fatten on our labor?" The barn fell silent. No one had dared speak so plainly before, yet we knew his words were true. And so we swore an oath. By candlelight, each of us placed a hand on the rough wood of the table and vowed to rise when the signal came. We would not pay. We would join with others who felt as we did. We would march until our voices reached the king himself. News spread like wildfire. In Essex, villagers had driven out the taxmen with stones and staves. In Kent, peasants gathered by the hundreds, armed with sickles and cudgels. Across the land, the cry was the same. No more serfdom, no more bondage, justice for the commons. We left our fields untended and joined the tide. My son William walked beside me, his young face alight with fierce determination. He carried nothing but a stout ash staff, yet he looked as proud as any knight. Every mile we marched, more joined us. Smiths, shepherds, craftsmen, even parish priests who shared our anger. Women marched too, carrying baskets of food, tending the wounded, shouting defiance as loud as any man. At first, our targets were the symbols of oppression. Tax offices burned, records torn and trampled. Manorial rolls listing rents and services, those chains of parchment that bound us to servitude, were fed to the flames. In one manor we stormed, the steward begged for mercy. Some wished to kill him, but Matthew held us back. "Strike at the system, not the man," he said. "Our fight is with bondage, not vengeance." Yet not all were so restrained. In towns along the way, officials were beaten, some slain. Fear rode ahead of us, clearing our path. London in sight. By June the rebel host swelled to tens of thousands. Never had England seen such a gathering of common folk. From every shire they came, flowing toward London like rivers joining the sea. At our head marched Wat Tyler, a bold man of Kent, chosen as leader for his courage and clear voice. Alongside him strode John Ball, the preacher whose words had lit our hearts. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? He cried to the crowd, and we roared in answer. At last, from a rise in the road, we saw the towers of London against the sky. For many, it was the first glimpse of the capital, a city of wealth, stone walls, and power beyond imagining. Yet we did not falter. We believed our cause just, and that even kings must listen when a nation speaks. The gates of the city. The gates of London closed against us, guarded by soldiers in mail. But within the city were allies. Apprentices, poor laborers, discontented townsfolk who shared our grievances. They opened the gates in secret, and we poured inside. London trembled that day. We surged through the streets, past St. Paul's great spire, past shops and markets. Some cried out in welcome, others cowered behind shutters. The houses of hated officials were stormed, their riches seized or destroyed. In one square, a judge who had long enforced the statute of laborers was dragged forth. The crowd shouted for justice, and he was struck down. But it was not blind chaos. Our leaders kept us focused. Our demand was clear: an end to serfdom, fair wages, freedom from unjust taxes, and punishment for corrupt lords. King Richard II was but a boy of 14 then, yet he faced us with more courage than some men thrice his age. From a barge on the Thames, he addressed the mass of rebels gathered on the banks. "My people," he called, his voice carrying across the water, "what would you have of your king?" The cry rose like thunder: freedom, justice, the end of bondage. Wat Tyler stepped forward as our spokesman. He demanded the abolition of serfdom, the right for every man to work where he wished, and the removal of corrupt officials who had bled the land dry. The king, perhaps fearful, perhaps sincere, nodded. "It shall be done," he declared. "Go home in peace, all men shall be free." For a moment it seemed victory was ours. We embraced, tears in our eyes. Some fell to their knees, praising God. Never before had a king promised such a thing to peasants. We believed a new world was dawning. A shadow over the triumph. Yet not all were convinced. Wat Tyler urged caution. "Words are wind," he warned us. "We must see these promises written, sealed, and delivered, and until then we must remain strong." The following day, we assembled again at Smithfield to press the matter further. I stood among the throng, my son William at my side, when Tyler rode forward to speak with the king once more. I watched as he leaned from his horse, bold and unflinching. But then tempers flared. Accounts differ, but some say he insulted the king's attendants, others that he reached for his dagger. Suddenly, the Lord Mayor of London, William Walworth, lunged. His sword flashed, and Tyler fell, blood staining the dust. A gasp went through the crowd. Our leader lay dying. Panic trembled at the edges of our host. Would we charge? Would we scatter? Then, astonishingly, the boy king himself rode forward. "You shall have no captain but me," he called, his voice steady. "Follow me, and I will be your leader." Confusion held us. To strike now would be to strike at the king himself, treason beyond forgiveness. Many wavered, unsure. Some began to drift away, and so the moment passed. The chance for final victory slipped from our grasp like sand between fingers. Suppression. The promises were soon broken. Pardons granted one day were revoked the next. Leaders captured were executed. John Ball was taken and hanged, drawn and quartered. Rebels who had returned home in trust were hunted down, whipped, or fined. The dream of sudden freedom was crushed beneath mailed fists. In Greystone, the sheriff rode in with soldiers, demanding names of those who had marched. I claimed I had gone only to seek justice for the tax, nothing more. Many said the same. Some were believed, others not. My son William narrowly escaped arrest, hiding in the woods until the danger passed. The rebellion was over, drowned in blood. Yet though defeated, something had changed forever. We had stood tens of thousands strong and looked power in the eye. We had spoken of equality, of freedom, of justice, not as distant dreams, but as rights within our grasp. And though crushed, those words would not die. The summer of rebellion faded into autumn. Where once the roads had thundered with the tread of tens of thousands, now they lay quiet again. But the silence was different from that which followed the plague. This silence was heavy with memory, with betrayal, with the knowledge of what had been dared and lost. In the fields of Greystone, we bent our backs to the harvest once more. The king's soldiers still patrolled, watching for whispers of defiance. Many of our neighbors had vanished, some to the gallows, some fleeing north or west to avoid the hangman's rope. Yet despite the fear, we worked with a new pride. For though the revolt had been crushed, it had planted something within us that no sword could cut down. Broken promises. At first, the boy king's charters were read aloud in marketplaces across England, charters declaring freedom for serfs, fair wages, an end to bondage. We heard them and wept with joy, but days later came the retraction. These promises were made under duress, the lords declared. They hold no weight. The charters were torn, the ink barely dry before it was denied. When news reached our village, anger flared again. "So we are fools," muttered Thomas bitterly. "Fools to trust a king's word." Yet others cautioned silence. The sheriff had already punished many. To speak too loudly was to invite ruin. Still, the memory of those broken promises stayed with us, simmering like embers beneath ash. Shadows of fear. The crackdowns were brutal. In Essex, men were dragged from their beds at night, accused of plotting fresh risings. In Kent, women who had shouted in the streets were whipped before crowds. The authorities meant to teach us fear, and in part they succeeded. Many of us kept our heads low, speaking only in whispers of the days in London. My son William was restless. "Father," he said one night as we mended harnesses by the fire, "we cannot live like this forever. We fought, we bled. And for what? To return to servitude?" I looked at him, young, fierce, unwilling to accept defeat. I thought of my father, who had lived and died a serf without question. And I saw the gulf between them. The revolt might have been beaten, but it had opened the eyes of a new generation. "Patience, my son," I said. "Seeds take time to grow, even seeds watered with blood." Quiet shifts. The years passed. Lords still demanded obedience, but something had shifted in the balance. Too many laborers had seen their worth, too many had marched shoulder to shoulder with thousands like themselves. Fear of rebellion lingered, not only among peasants but among the nobility. They knew now what common folk could do when pressed too far. Gradually, serfdom began to wither. Not by decree but by practice. More lords found it easier to offer wages than to enforce labor services on unwilling tenants. Men slipped away from their villages, and though laws forbade it, they found new masters who turned a blind eye. The statute of laborers became harder and harder to enforce, like trying to dam a river with one's hands. In Greystone, Lord Edmund's manor continued to crumble. His wealth could no longer command the loyalty of many. He paid wages grudgingly, but he paid them still, for what choice did he have? When he died, his heir leased out much of the land rather than bind tenants. Slowly the old bonds loosened. It was not only the fields that changed, but the minds of men. The pestilence had already shaken our faith in the church's certainties. How could holy men explain why God struck down priest and sinner alike? Now the revolt made us question earthly power as well. If all men were created equal under God, as John Ball had preached, then why should some wear crowns and others chains? I remember sitting in the tavern one winter night, listening to younger men speak boldly. They spoke of education, of sending their sons to towns to learn trades, of priests who taught letters, not just prayers. Some even spoke of questioning the bishops, of reading scripture in English rather than Latin. Such talk would once have been dangerous heresy. Now it was common. We were learning slowly that authority could be challenged, that it was not fixed as the stars, but as changeable as the seasons. The decline of serfdom. By the time I reached my 60th year, the world looked different indeed. Few still called themselves serfs. More and more worked for wages, held leases, or moved to towns where guilds offered protection. The word freeman was heard often and with pride. My daughter Alice married a carpenter in a nearby town. She walked away from the manor without asking leave, something my father would have thought impossible. My son William became a steward on leased land, respected for his skills, not bound by birth. The revolt had failed in its moment, but in truth it had succeeded in time. A changed landscape. The land itself bore the mark of change. Fields that once stretched unbroken were divided into sheep pastures, for wool brought profit greater than grain. Villages that had been abandoned in the plague years never recovered, left to crumble into ruins. But towns grew, markets thrived, and trade spread wider than before. And in all of it the common folk held a stronger place. Our labor had value, our voices weight. We might still bow to lords, but the bow was shallower, less certain. They knew it, and so did we. Each year when June came, I thought back to those days in London. The roar of the crowd, the sight of the boy king. The moment when we believed freedom had been won. It was a bitter memory, yet also sweet, for though it ended in blood, it had shown us what was possible. Sometimes by the fire, William would urge me to tell the tale again. "Tell me of Smithfield, father," he would say. "Tell me how Tyler faced the king." And I would tell it, though my voice trembled. He listened with shining eyes as if hearing of heroes. Perhaps we were not heroes. Perhaps we were only desperate men and women pushed too far. Yet history, I think, will remember us differently, not for our failure, but for the spark we lit. Legacy. Now, as I sit in the twilight of my days, I see more clearly. The Black Death had torn the old world apart, ripping away half its people and with them the chains that bound the rest. The revolt had been its aftershock, fierce and bloody, but also necessary. It forced the kingdom to reckon with us, the common folk. True, we did not win all we sought. Serfdom was not abolished by decree, nor did justice sweep corruption from the land. But the current of change was too strong to be dammed. Wages rose, mobility spread, dignity grew. A new age was dawning, one where ordinary men and women mattered more than ever before. The church, too, could no longer command blind obedience. Questions grew louder, about wealth, about authority, about truth itself, and in time, I believe, those questions will shake even the mightiest thrones. Epilogue: The Survivor's Reflection. When I walk the fields now, I see more than soil and barley. I see ghosts, of my mother and sister taken by the plague, of comrades who marched beside me and never returned, of leaders like Tyler and Ball who dared dream of a freer world. I do not weep though sorrow is heavy, instead I give thanks, for from their loss something new was born, a world where my children can walk with heads high, where no man is wholly master and no man wholly slave. The Black Death destroyed, the revolt bled, but from ruin and blood grew hope, and hope once planted cannot be killed.